Let's continue. If there are problems, please let us know. Okay, so the World Rainforest Movement has organized this space with the objective of reflecting about the many and diverse layers of negative impacts that the REDD mechanism has brought about over the last 15 years. REDD, which means reducing emissions from deforestation and forest degradation, was introduced in the climate negotiations of the UN as a dominant policy regarding forests, particularly in tropical countries. And so it's not by chance that this conversation has been organized today, because we are on the eve of a new round of climate negotiations of the UN. So it was the UN that brought about the logic of offsets, which is this wrong idea that pollution in one place can be compensated, quote unquote, offset somewhere else by different actors, different activities. This logic has allowed for criminals, corporate criminals, to continue their business as usual and obtain a so-called green image or sustainable or carbon neutral image, greenwash in other words. And the capitalist system that depends on fossil fuels has been able to continue as always. REDD, or so-called nature-based solutions or commitments for net zero emissions, is based and depends on this logic, with the support of some conservationist NGOs, multilateral organizations, corporations, and others. So we can say a lot about the impact of this policy on territories with forest territories, and that's why we're here. It's important to emphasize how the narrative that the REDD proponents have told time and time again over the last 15 years regarding that the communities that live in the forest are the ones that are to blame for deforestation, and therefore REDD would reduce it. This discourse, this narrative, which is colonialist and racist, makes it easier to establish restrictions and prohibitions for forest communities on what they can do, whether they can access and use the resources or the lands of their own forests. So therefore, REDD, and for this reason, doesn't establish prohibitions or restrictions or on oil companies, mining companies, on logging or infrastructure projects, etc. Our publication, 15 Years of REDD, a mechanism rotten at the core, brings together articles that reflect, 11 articles that reflect on the fundamental dimensions and dangerous dimensions of REDD. One of the common threads of this publication is the idea that REDD has converted, in fact, into an underlying cause of deforestation and the plunder, basically, of indigenous peoples and communities that rely on forests. So here we have most of the authors of this publication present today with other guests. And we have a lot of people that are joining. Many people have registered. So to give us enough time for everyone, WRM has proposed a question for each author, and they have the tough challenge of answering in 5 minutes. The idea is that this leaves us enough time for some debate, some Q&A at the end. We hope to hear from you as well, of course. So we invite you to write your questions and comments in the chat if you have one, and we will be gathering them for the final exchange at the end. For the speakers, please speak slowly to help us with the simultaneous translation. So, we are starting now with our guests. The first participant is Yuta Kill, member of the WRM Secretariat. Here we go. So we can confidently say by now that REDD has failed to address deforestation and forest degradation, and worse, it has also intensified the climate crisis and left the causes of deforestation untouched. Yet, in your article, you argue that this obvious failure is just a part of the whole story of the implications of 15 years of implementing REDD. Why do you claim that REDD has not been just a failure? Why are we talking about REDD at the UN after 15 years of failing in its objectives?
Thank you, Joanna. Let me see if I can share the screen, and without losing too much time, can you quickly tell me if you see the right screen? You see the slides? Okay, super. So why is REDD still being discussed if deforestation is continuing to go up, or at least has not been reduced as promised by the mechanism? One important reason is that reducing deforestation, I would argue, never really was the reason or the main motivation for the introduction of REDD. If one would have wanted to devise an instrument that really reduces deforestation effectively and efficiently, it would have looked very different from what REDD is. So if not reducing deforestation, what then perhaps were the other reasons and objectives of REDD? And looking at those and identifying those maybe help us understand why, despite continued highest levels of deforestation, REDD as an instrument, and now, as Joanna said, nature-based solutions as the successor of REDD, continue to take up so much space at UN climate discussions. As I've explained in the article, looking only at the deforestation, therefore, gives us only part of the picture and really keeps us from seeing who else has gained and where REDD has not been a failure at all. So it has not been a failure for the oil industry and many of the other industries that are responsible for the climate crisis that we find ourselves in. Because, somebody needs to close their microphone, please. So if can somebody, somebody has their microphone, okay. So if we look at who might have benefited from REDD, the oil and mining industry are very much at the, are amongst those who have gained, because for them, REDD has served as a distraction from what really should be discussed not only at the UN conferences, but in society by and large, and that is how to cut our dependence from fossil fuels and how to keep fossil fuels in the ground. Instead of focusing on the carbon stores underneath the ground, which are the destruction of which makes the big profits for the oil and mining companies. They have been very happy, as you will see, as you see in the picture of Italy's oil company, which on its website promises to protect and conserve forests, was all too happy to focus our attention and the UN climate negotiations attention away from the underground carbon stores that make the million and billion profits for the oil and gas and coal industry onto the carbon that is stored in the forests. Anything as long as the discussion stays away from meaningful, effective, and efficient ways of keeping oil in the soil, coal in the hole, and the gas in the underground deposits. Another reason, or another aspect where REDD has not failed, or another group perhaps that REDD has not failed, is the large conservation industry. They have made large amounts of money from capacity building after capacity building workshop, and from introducing methodologies used to measure carbon with huge error margins. If anybody, again, if the objective were to protect forests, one would have chosen an entirely different approach than the approach of REDD that chases carbon, tons of carbon in the forest, which fluctuate over huge volumes. The third reason why I would argue that looking at REDD as a failure only keeps us from seeing the big damage that REDD has done is by looking at the array of so-called carbon neutral projects that are available today. You can, if you live in the industrialized world, you can almost not buy anything anymore or do anything anymore without the promise that what you're buying or doing is carbon neutral. All of this, and a lot of the times, REDD and forests play a crucial role in making us continue to buy and use services that are damaging the climate. So to stop and conclude my 5 minutes, why is REDD still being discussed, even though it has phenomenally failed to drive down deforestation? I think it's very simple. There are too many others who profit from the fossil fuel industry who are quite happy to use REDD and the forest as a carbon store to distract from anything that could eat into their profits. And concluding with saying that at the price of also increasing the control over land used by peasant farming families and indigenous people. So on the one hand, REDD has been a massive distraction from the need to focus on keeping the fossil carbon stores intact, and that means ending burning of oil, coal, and gas. And on the other hand, REDD has had the devastating impact of centralizing control over forests, either in the state's hands or giving control to over indigenous peoples' forested lands or forests and peasant farming lands to projects that claim to reduce emissions from deforestation. I leave it there. I think my 5 minutes must be more than over. Thank you very much.
Sí, pero muchas gracias, Yuta. Eso nos da un claro panorama para ver realmente los intereses que
Thank you, Yuta. This is a very good outline of the mechanism and who the interests at play. Now our next guest is Yvonne Yanis. Yvonne, are you here?
Ya. ¿Se ve? ¿Estoy? Te escucho. Ok. Bueno. Ya. Ahí está. Yvonne Yanes, buenos días por allá en Ecuador. Ella es miembro de la...
Yvonne is a member of Acción Ecológica in Ecuador, a member of the Oil Watch Network in Latin America. Good morning. We know that the fossil fuels industry, the oil industry in particular, has been one of the most active pushers of carbon offsets. They have supported, heavily lobbied for, and promoted carbon trading under different names, such as REDD, or more recently, nature-based solutions. They are also major buyers of carbon offsets, and they are doing so with the support of several so-called conservationist organizations. So how is it possible that the main driver of the climate crisis, the oil industry, is leading the demand for the so-called solution proposed by the United Nations? Thank you very much, Joanna. Greetings to all of the people who have joined in a very significant number. We have 73 people participating today. This seems to be a good number because, and that's just on Zoom, because the issue of REDD and offsets generates a lot of confusion, including among organizations that are friends, that are sister and brother organizations that are opposed to the oil activities and mining activities, and very often are in favor of this kind of market mechanisms created precisely to continue exploiting gas, coal, minerals, and oil. In these few minutes, what I would like to start saying is that for the last 60 years, almost 60 years, we've known that the main cause of global warming are the emissions of CO2 that come from the extraction and consumption of fossil fuels. The main cause, the main source. And the first people to know this were the oil companies. So there are videos of scientists working for oil companies 50 years ago that already spoke about global warming back then, decades ago. So what we also know is that capitalism, as we know it, the energy, the main source of energy for the capitalist system are the fossil fuels. Fossil fuels as carbon, oil, as some coal, gas, and oil mainly. And these mechanisms we are talking about, these offset mechanisms like REDD and all the other acronyms that have been bouncing around for the last 25 years, clean development mechanism, etc. All these now so-called nature-based solutions and all the whole institutionality of the United Nations, all the bodies related, and also the international financial system, they have promoted these false solutions to tackle climate change. But in fact, it was never created with this aim in mind. It was invented to be able to continue the extraction processes and the extraction and consumption processes of fossil fuels. It's important to signal that when we talk about the oil industry, we can't think about only about the companies like Chevron, Texaco, BP, etc. When we talk about oil industry, we're talking about the fossil capitalism, fossil fuel capitalism. We're talking about, for example, industrial agriculture, which consumes a lot of fossil fuels and emits in other fashion as well. Also, the military apparatus. The military apparatus is a huge emitter and consumer of fossil fuels, but also a financial system that, of course, largely depends on the money that rolls around in this whole industrial, extractivist, military apparatus connected to fossil fuels. So simply, these mechanisms that were not an invention necessarily of the oil companies or the mining companies, it was a creation, let's say, of the capitalists because what they wanted, we know what the problem is, but we don't want to deal with it. We want to invent these mechanisms to so-called compensate, offset what is unoffsetable, which are the CO2 emissions. The second part, the last thing I'm going to say is that I want to mention basically two things. Firstly, that we have to avoid saying that despite the climate change negotiations, despite these mechanisms, the problem hasn't been solved of CO2 emissions and climate crisis. No, we have to say, always refer to not despite, but we have to say because these have happened, because these mechanisms have been invented, because the UN system with all of its structures, that is why emissions have not been stopped or reduced, have continued to expand. Another question that I want to mention, referring to what I said in the beginning, is that there is a danger, a major danger, not just because there are many organizations, local organizations that in one way or another being convinced of joining this kind of mechanism, whether it's at jurisdictional level or voluntary market or red type markets. The problem is that this moment we might be creating another type of relationship with this kind of mechanism, which is, it requires thinking that there isn't a market, a quote unquote market related to offsets, carbon offsets, that it could be a good idea. So you have an indigenous peoples that is against the oil extraction, that has some kind of offset agreement with institutions, academic institutions in the United States, for instance. This is seen as a way to break with the mechanism, the market mechanisms, and the REDD mechanisms which the UN are promoting, because you're proposing something that is different, a different way. And in this way, yes, we can confront the issue of global warming and fossil fuel burning. So we are at the doorstep of watching, of witnessing. Maybe Tom can say something about this later on, about these problems, that there's a trend, many local organizations, territorial organizations, and many organizations that support this kind of proposals, thinking that they are different and therefore are proper solutions to this, solve the problem of the REDD projects and how they fool people. So look at everything that is happening with China, the huge domestic market of emissions that they are developing and have been doing so for some time. This is an important thing to follow up. It seems that they want to perpetuate the extraction and burning of fossil fuels.
Thank you, Yvonne. Thank you for helping us to remember what does fossil fuels mean. It is a system, a very well organized one, and several horizons. There's about the threats, but also about we have some signs of hope there too. Now I'd like to invite Tamra Hilbertson. Are you there?
I'm here.
Don't forget
Hi,
to
Joanna.
turn off your microphones.
It's so good to see you, Papa.
Aprovecho de decirles a todas y a todos para que
I'd like to remind you to put your comments and questions on the chat so we can gather them for the final discussion. Tamra is a member of the Indigenous Environmental Network. She has a PhD and she studied the offsets, carbon offsets in Colombia. And so there goes your mining companies and coal companies in particular are using REDD projects that are implemented in Colombia and are causing an array of local impacts to avoid paying taxes for their mining operations. This also allows these companies to claim carbon neutrality. This is my question, what can we learn from this carbon tax paying scheme to alert other countries that are getting ready for doing national carbon markets involving forests like Peru, Malaysia, the Republic of Congo, or Gabon?
Yeah, thank you for the question, Joanna, and everybody at WRM for organizing this meeting. It's really, really nice to be here and to see so many lovely, familiar faces. Thank you so much. And for the book, wow, it's been a great success. On the question of carbon taxes, I think that I want to frame this around something that a lot of us have dealt with for a long time. And even in the early days of fighting carbon trading and REDD, we would get, a lot of really, nervous, defensive people and kind of screaming at you saying, well, what's your solution? Which I now just see as a way to, sort of try to silence us, and that we're winning in a way, in some ways. But in that question, often people would really quickly change that and shift that over to saying, but then there's carbon taxes, so we have to tax them. We have to use carbon taxes. And perhaps some of those people were well-meaning in the early days, but clearly don't understand how taxes function. So we did a really deep dive, Tom and I and a few others a few years ago, looking at carbon taxes and different types of schemes around the world. And what we found was countries that have had different types of fossil fuel taxes or emissions taxes or other types of tax programs never actually reduced, bringing fossil fuels out of the ground. It didn't keep it from coming out of the ground. And on the argument of a carbon tax itself, if you're taxing an emission, that this is a fossil fuel that has already been extracted, it's already been combusted, this is really an ex post facto issue, right? It's already out. So a couple of things on that. One is that the fossil fuel taxes themselves and the carbon taxes themselves don't actually keep fossil fuels in the ground. So if that is our objective, that doesn't work. We've also found that different types of taxes like that get passed on to consumers, or are paid for by consumers, or they inflate wages. The industry doesn't pay for it. They have offshore tax havens. They know exactly how to work with taxes, and it's really a drop in the bucket. So carbon taxes, just my first point, really are not going to do the heavy lift that would be needed to keep fossil fuels in the ground. But my second point that I really want to talk about a little bit more are how carbon taxes themselves, carbon taxes, end up being a stepping stone or a first step for some countries to set up compliance systems or cap and trade systems inside of the domestic situations. And this is something that I've focused on really deeply in my research in Colombia. And so sort of going into this a little bit deeper before I get into the Colombia example is just to say that any type of taxes, whatever they are, they're not designed to stop capital accumulation. It's not designed to stop capital. In fact, they're designed to continue it. And in that way, creating a carbon tax would never stop climate change or even make the quote unquote polluter pay, whatever that means. Because this is embedded then inside of different types of financial situations or finance situations. And that sort of the type of neoliberal governance that we've seen with financialization of nature runs parallel, to the rise of finance and conservation and climate financial schemes that we've seen over the last few years. So it's the same market-based and financialized pathways that have been used in global economic development schemes and attempts to mitigate climate change that have also caused massive inequality and created a huge global divide in the global north and the global south and how we see finance. So I also want to direct you to a new report that we've written in IEN on climate finance, which I'll put in the chat in a moment. But back to Colombia and back to REDD. So what we found with the carbon tax program that was very much a stepping stone to set up the cap and trade and compliance system in Colombia. It was a greenhouse gas, inventory system is what it was called. And this was then to be set up around it, was that the carbon tax system was set up in a way that any type of, not any type, but it's certain types of pollution that were created inside the country, that those types of pollution would then have to be paid for with a percentage of a tax. Now, the coal mining industry in Colombia, for those of you that don't know, is huge. These are the largest open pit coal mines in the entire Western Hemisphere, the largest open pit coal mines. They massively impact indigenous Wayu people and Afro-Colombian people. They have impacts on waterways, land use, all different types of programs and projects. When the carbon tax was implemented, it's not counted for the coal that's actually that's extracted from the coal mines, because 98% of that coal is exported from the country. The majority of it still goes to Europe. And then that is shifting in a global landscape. But what the coal mining industries were taxed on is for the machinery. And so all of the machinery that is used to extract all of that coal, they have to pay a carbon tax on it. But when the carbon tax was set up, it was set up in a way that the industry itself can, instead of paying that bill for the carbon tax, they can then use other mechanisms. And one of those mechanisms is REDD. And so on the other side of the country, where there were REDD programs that are impacting Afro-Colombian communities along the Pacific coast, who live in very violent situations that are perpetuated by a long history of colonial violence, of course, those REDD programs were implemented very much outside of by US aid. Okay, so big multilateral, big aid agencies. US aid is front and center there. Big conservation NGOs as well involved, and they had a seat at the table to basically write these laws as they were being written in Congress in Colombia. And so what happens is that the coal mining industries don't end up paying for the carbon tax. They basically do these incommensurable compensations, or these unequal offset programs through REDD that impacts communities on one side, Afro-Colombian and indigenous Wayuu, who are impacted by the mines, and on the other side, who are impacted and being told what they can and cannot do in forests. So not only does this have a huge impact on the communities there, on the fact that basically it's a tax break for the coal mining industries, but it also means that carbon taxes are the stepping stone to create this much larger program. And inside the Paris Agreement, we have lost common but differentiated responsibilities. So that means that countries in the global north can create their own types of domestic programs, but we're also seeing for the first time, starting in 2019, is a massive rise in the voluntary carbon markets. Like we've never seen. They've superseded the compliance markets for the first time ever, and we see that as well in the massive build out of nature-based solutions, which includes REDD, or sort of a rebranding, but includes REDD is still its own thing in different ways. But also that's to push for soil offsets. So I see that almost as a way that I don't see REDD here at all. I'm here, I don't see any signs anymore. There's nobody talking about REDD. You don't hear about REDD. It's completely been silenced here, but nature-based solutions has taken a space, and soil offsets are definitely on the menu. And so I just want to end there to say that types of nested REDD, like inside of carbon tax programs, are more of what we see now. Huge build outs inside of the voluntary carbon markets, nature-based solutions. So the private industries like Google and Amazon and the other ones can say that they are net zero, or they're meeting their net zero targets, or countries can say that. So I'm going to stop there. We're seeing a whole different sort of shift in the language, like Joanna talked about how the narrative has changed, and it's changing really fast. And I'm keeping a list of words I've never heard of before, and I can share those, and I'm gonna pass it back over. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Tami. Gracias, voy a seguir con el español.
Thank you. You are showing us a good image of how the companies are using the REDD mechanism and the offset mechanisms in various ways. And how is this impacting territories and people? And thank you for helping us to be aware of the new devices that are being used in the negotiations. Please remind yourself of turning off your microphones, and please put your comments and questions on the chat so we can look at them for the final discussion. So our next the next person, the next speaker will be Diego.
Diego es
So here you are, Diego.
Amigos de la Tierra,
He's
Colombia.
from Sensat, Friends of the Earth,
Aquí
Colombia.
ahora nos vemos.
And now we can see each other.
Buenos días también por allá.
Good morning to
Invitamos
you
a Diego para que nos
there,
comparta una
and we would
reflexión
like
sobre la
to
situación actual en
ask
Colombia, que es
Diego
muy
to
particular.
share about the situation in Colombia
Entonces,
right now, a very particular one.
bueno,
So,
muchos sabrán que el nuevo
um,
presidente en Colombia
the
ha
new
llegado con
president
una
in
agenda de
Colombia,
izquierda,
as you may know, has
pretende
come with
priorizar
a
muchas
left
de las
agenda,
agendas
promising to
históricas
bring many of
de
the
los
historical
movimientos sociales y las
grievances
comunidades de los
from the
bosques
social
y
movements and local communities to the
sin
center.
embargo, sabemos que existe la
However,
latente
there is
amenaza
a
que
latent
también podemos
threat,
percibir en otros
which we
gobiernos
can
de
also
izquierda
perceive
en
in
la
other
región de
left governments
Latinoamérica y en otras
in
partes,
the Latin American
de
region and in
presentar a
other
la
parts of the
economía
world
verde,
of
a esta
presenting
llamada
the green
economía verde
economy,
que incluye a
the
REDD,
so-called green
a las
economy,
soluciones
including
basadas en
REDD,
la
the so-called
naturaleza y otros
nature-based
mecanismos
solutions, and other
que
similar
contienen la misma lógica
mechanisms
de compensación,
with the same
como una
offsetting
buena agenda política del
logics
medio
as
ambiente,
a
sobre el
good
medio ambiente, sobre el
environmental
cambio
policy
climático, y
agenda,
además
and
como una agenda de
on top
izquierda,
of
es
this,
decir, como
as a
si estuviera
left
del lado de los
policy,
pueblos.
as on the
Entonces,
side of the people.
nos parece crucial esta
Uh,
pregunta en estos
so this is a
momentos.
very important question
¿Cuáles son
right
los
now.
peligros de esta
What
amenaza
are the
y
dangers
cuáles
of this
podrían ser las
threat
estrategias
and the
para fortalecer los
strategies for
movimientos que están
strengthening
luchando contra ella?
the movements against it?
Bueno, primero un buen día o un
Well,
saludo más bien.
first of all,
No sé si es tarde o noche para
greetings
todas, para todos.
to
Bueno,
you
muy
all.
contento
Good
de muy
morning
inspirado,
or
¿no?
good
Ver
evening.
que hay tantas
It is
personas
very inspiring to
interesadas
see
en
this
el tema.
many people interested
Entonces,
in
bueno,
the
eso
topic.
nos inspira mucho pues cómo va a seguir.
So this is very
Respondiendo
inspiring
a la
for us.
pregunta que nos comparte Joana,
And
pues quería iniciar por algo que
to
puede ser
answer the
una
question,
generalidad, ¿no? Cuando nos
I
preguntas
would
cuáles
like
son
to
las
start
amenazas. Entonces,
with
estoy
something
compartiendo la
that
pantalla, no sé si
can
ahí la pueden ver.
appear as something
Sí, perfecto.
too general, too
Queríamos,
broad. I'm
preparamos este tema que
sharing
no solamente lo
my
estoy hablando yo,
screen
pero
right
es
now,
una intervención que preparamos en conjunto con las compañeras
and
del
we
área
have
de selvas acá en
prepared
Sensat.
this
Estuvimos pensando acerca de esta
presentation
pregunta
together with
y bueno,
uh,
nos gustaría
some
mostrar
comrades,
primero
and
este comunicado. Esto es un
we
comunicado
thought
que
a lot
hace la
about
Autoridad
this
Ambiental de la
question, and
Amazonía
we wanted to
colombiana,
share
se llama Corpo
this
Amazonía, en
message
el cual advierte a
issued
pueblos
by
indígenas
the
y comunidades
Amazon
locales
Environmental
de Amazonía
Authority from
en el año
Colombia,
2019 acerca
warning the local
de
communities and
ONGs
indigenous people in
o empresas,
2019 about
cooperativas,
the
ONGs o
NGOs
empresas que están en el
and
territorio
companies
gestionando proyectos de
that are
compra
active in
o
their
venta de bonos de
territories,
carbono, es decir, proyectos tipo REDD,
managing
que sabemos ha
projects
cambiado
for
muchísimo
selling and buying carbon
después
credits
de todos
like
los
REDD,
escándalos que ha
and
habido,
we
las
know that that
denuncias.
has
Los nombres
changed
cambian, no
name
necesariamente dicen REDD en
many
este caso, pero
times
acá, por ejemplo, se
after
habla de
scandals
compra-venta
and
de bonos de carbono o de
being
compra de
denounced. So they're not mentioning REDD,
hidrocarburos, por
they're
ejemplo. Entonces,
talking about
cajas o bolsas o el
buying
oxígeno, ¿no? Que
and
es lo que se van
selling
a pagar.
carbon
Entonces, la
titles.
autoridad ambiental acá advierte que no tiene
So,
conocimiento de quiénes son esas
as if they
empresas, de
could be
quiénes son
paid in
esas
boxes of
ONGs,
oxygen. We
pero
do not
advierte
know
que
who are
hay una serie de
these companies
estafas
or
o de
NGOs,
engaños a las poblaciones.
but
Entonces les advierte que no
they
sabe quiénes
show
son, que no las puede regular en la
there is
legislación colombiana. Cuando se le
the
pregunta al Ministerio de
populations are being
Ambiente, cuando se le
deceived,
pregunta a la Fiscalía,
and
cuando se le
there's
pregunta
no
al Ministerio Público,
device in the
a todos
Colombian
estos contratos, pues
legislation
todos dicen que no,
to
esto es un
regulate that.
negocio privado entre dos particulares que firman
When
un
we talk
contrato,
about the
está puesto
contract,
en una bolsa
everyone will
de valores
say this is
y por
a
tanto
private
no hay
agreement
quien lo regule.
between
No puede
private
entrar ni el
parts. This is part
ministerio,
of
ninguna
what
autoridad.
is at stake
Y por tanto, con lo que firmen,
in the
las
financial
comunidades,
markets. This is
y
not
primero
an
como
object
particular,
of
sí
regulation
puedan
by
ejercer
the
de lo que les
authority.
proponga
So the
el mercado
communities
y la empresa o la ONG.
who
Por tanto,
sign
lo
those
que en
contracts
resumen dice la
as
última línea, este mensaje va a
private
estar muy pequeño ahí para
actors,
ustedes, pero quería que lo vieran
they
ahí
will
oficialmente
be
de parte de ellos, es que
buying
recomendamos a las
to
comunidades
what
rurales que
these
se abstengan
NGOs
de
or
entregar
companies
documentos,
want.
dinero
And
u otra
here in
información
the
solicitada por
final
dichas
part of the
organizaciones
document,
hasta tanto no se
we
certifica de su
warn
veracidad.
these communities
Pues bueno, han pasado varios
not
años,
to
han
deliver
pasado
any
varios de estos
documents or
comunicados y
money
la
or
advertencia sigue siendo la misma. Las
information
comunidades siguen siendo
to
engañadas,
these organizations
el
if they
mercado
are not
voluntario es el que ha crecido enormemente en el país.
sure about
Cientos de contratos,
the
millones de
contracts. But
hectáreas con proyectos
still,
de este
these
tipo se siguen
communities are
firmando
being
continuamente y
seized
pues digamos los riesgos que advertíamos
while
antes de que
the
entraran a operación,
carbon
ya
markets
en el año
grow.
2007 cuando empezamos a
And
analizar
the
esto en
risk,
conjunto, decíamos no
a
nosotros,
risk
sino
we
digamos
were
todas las
aware of
organizaciones que estamos
in 2017 when we started analyzing this kind of thing and all the other organizations that are present in Colombia. I wanted to show you here. It is about a research by Andrés Bermúdez, who have published a lot already. So this says the territory of the jaguars of Yurupari is being divided by a credit, carbon credit project. So this is a huge project, and we see that what's happening there is the same happening in other parts of the world. The leaders are convinced, male leaders, they sign a contract with this company by contracts that are signed by individuals. So this causes division in the communities. The contracts are um, many times the communities will claim they have not been consulted, so this contract will not have legal value, and populations do not know what the projects mean, with all the threats that we know. So the vision of the communities and the deterritorialization are the results of this kind of program. Sometimes people will get some money for it, but probably they will have to leave their land. They will have to move to a place where they cannot grow food. They are expelled from their territories and they are kept waiting for money that will not arrive, that will not be paid. That's the case of Colombia. We had warned many people about this years ago. What are the risks, the political risks for the country that make this situation so worse? First is the possibility of changing the priorities of the social movement. Well, this government has been recently elected and has the legitimacy, the political legitimacy by popular voting, but also by the support of popular movement, recognizing that the proposals of the government may be positive and that we have to support them. But among these proposals, there is this idea of saving the Amazon using green economy, specifically carbon markets. And we have an explicit proposal of selling more carbon titles. And this is really problematic because the government that is presenting itself as a progressive one is proposing this. This we have been resisting over the past decade. There's not enough analysis, there's not enough information. There are people involved that will promote it, that will present it as a good thing, saying that this will help the conservation of the forest and the territory, and the population will believe in that, will trust that, understanding that this will bring benefits to the communities and the peoples. But we see a very strong contradiction there because the idea is to present Colombia as a sponge for absorbing the pollution that's being created in developed countries, as if this could be true. But we know that it doesn't work, that this is false. But it is also not the complete picture. It's incomplete in terms of the proposal of the government of finding peace, of building peace and environmental justice. As you've seen, uh, that the companies that are extracting carbon could compensate the destruction of the Caribbean with, they say that they could compensate the destruction of the Caribbean, creating a carbon market in the Amazon. But how to How do you build environmental justice if you're deepening the injustice between two people, violating other people's territory and rights? So there is a contradiction, a very deep contradiction there. And these are the risks that are growing deeper at the moment. So how to work with communities and the movement? Well, over the past years, we have designed um, an initiative to oppose carbon markets and the green economy, what we call the community management of forests. This is the only option for conservation, not the carbon markets, not the reservation. We trust the collective management of the territories done by the communities there, the indigenous communities. And we are trying to present that to the authorities, trying to have this kind of management recognized as a way of using the territory, not leaving it intact, but providing financial support, investment in this, not doing all the investment towards conservation areas or carbon markets, but in the management of the territory by the community. We are trying, we many times we have to meet with the public institutions, but we have also been working on bring together the movement towards something that goes beyond the numbers, but trying to bring partners together, Afro-descendant people, indigenous people, communities, to have a common joint action in presenting proposals around um, the, the community handling of the territories. So not only addressing the problem, but moving forward in terms of solutions and proposals. And our proposal is the community management of the territories. We also find it very dangerous to try to stop to isolate the Amazon, yeah, or to addressing only the Amazon. The Amazon is not the only ecosystem. The, uh, our country has other types of forests, other types of ecosystems, and we should also address them to talk about all the types of forests, all the types, or all the peoples, recognizing the rights, not only with a very strong focus on the Amazon. It shouldn't be at all based in false solutions and carbon markets. And this is what we were working on with some partners of ours, and that's how we are going to reach our goals.
Thank you for this outline of your challenges. Maybe you can stop sharing your screen now, please. So I remind everyone, don't forget to keep your microphones off, and we have translation. So use the globe at the bottom of your screen or the three dots if you're on a cell phone. We are now going to welcome our next guest. I'm changing the order around a little bit from the original script. So I'm introducing Tom. Hello, Tom Goetooth. It's from the Indigenous Environmental Network in North America. So welcome, Tom. Good afternoon, good morning. In your article, in the publication, you explain how many conservation NGOs, international conservation NGOs, setting up and verifying carbon offsets, as well as the introduction of language, such as benefit sharing programs, certification schemes, safeguards, participation, among others, how these are impacting the unity of indigenous peoples and hurting solidarity at all levels. Why is this the case? And how can we strengthen solidarity? Thank you, Tom.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you for the question. And it's a very important issue, especially for allies and NGOs that are environmental focused or even the conservation NGOs. Many of them that I talk to, they approach me and say that they're confused. They're confused because they say when our indigenous environmental network and other indigenous peoples in the global south and in the north, when we make interventions, for an example, here at the United Nations conference meetings, the Conference of the Parties, we make interventions rejecting the carbon market mechanisms as false solutions. And also, we also make interventions rejecting geoengineering and techno fixes as well. Well, but with that, we've been getting more focus on the climate finance mechanisms as well, because it relies on a false system that the only strategy that they have here in the hallways of the Conference of the Parties is based upon a mitigation and adaptation, but also a finance strategies based upon false solutions. They're invested in it. Who is invested in it? You know, we have had to deal with the World Bank funding millions of dollars to indigenous intermediary organizations in the global south. Has made it very difficult for us to educate and to inform grassroots communities in the Amazon, in the forests, because they've already been convinced that participating in REDD Plus, and as well as this new branding that includes some of the REDD, the nature-based solution. They've been convinced that it's a mechanism to bring them money. Also, they've been convinced that it's a way to strengthen their struggles for obtaining title to their land. And we have done a lot of analysis of these mitigation and adaptation plans for a number of years. Some of you remember our strategy to create those little decals that say REDD with the cross through it. And we distribute, I would say, hundreds of thousands of those over 10 years. And it was very effective. It was a public relations disaster for a large NGOs. They are invested in this like the Nature Conservancy, like Environmental Defense Fund, like Conservation International, WWF, et cetera. I can go down a long list. But also the UN REDD program, countries like Norway, Germany, who have making big investments. So it's very political. As a small indigenous organization, the challenge is how do we develop a strategy of training indigenous peoples and also non-indigenous people, local communities, about the truth about these false solutions. We need a whole large convention room like we see here, of people that are trained to go into the communities and training our communities. And so we're challenged with these struggles. The Jeff Bezos Fund here that created the Earth Fund in the United States, immediately they funded $100 million grant to the big NGOs who are some of the major pushers of the carbon markets of REDD, of nature-based solution. So they benefited. And in the meantime, we are still struggling as indigenous peoples organizations and allies, as small community-based organizations, trying to educate and to counter this mass movement of corporate funded plans to spread lies and false solutions to our communities, to believe them, in what they're doing. In the North, in the United States, we're fighting millions of dollars that are being promised to our indigenous native nations to sign contracts, 90-year contracts, where they're being told that they're going to get benefit sharing, and we see the same thing that these entities have been telling our friends and relatives in Ecuador, like the Seriaku and other people who are here. And they believe in what we're saying. They're trying to hold the line, but other indigenous peoples are being convinced that this is a way that they're being recognized for their traditional indigenous knowledge, that the World Bank and these carbon monies, carbon offset funding is really starting to recognize what they've been doing for thousands of years is protecting the forests. Now that there's a value to that protection of the forest, they promise big money. So that's what we're confronting. I'm here at in Sharm el Sheikh, and me and Tamara and our indigenous rights attorney Alberto Saldamondo, and our elder from Minnesota, Mary Lyons, and Joseph White Eyes, our youth. And we brought a delegation from Brazil, from Acre, that see through these lies. But I've been a program of the UN that came out of the Paris Agreement called Local Communities and Indigenous Peoples Platform. And it's where the system, the corporations, the financial institutions, the promoters of REDD and carbon markets, they need indigenous peoples. They need local communities, forest-dependent communities. And so they're investing now to bring the knowledge holders, the indigenous people and local communities. Now they're saying they are the knowledge holders. So we are here very concerned because this is resulting in the co-optation of our communities from the tropics, from the Amazon, and from our indigenous peoples of the North, starting to create a split again some of our indigenous brothers and sisters here are being promised millions of dollars. The same thing happening to our tribal leaders in the north. So how do we build solidarity? That is the solid and a very important question as we talk about safeguards. And our attorney here, and he says there's no guarantee on safeguards. If a nation state violates local communities who are not indigenous, as well as indigenous peoples, who's going to hold a nation state accountable? Is it going to be a world court? And, we have to look at the realities of this logic that is false. And also the violation of the territorial integrity of the Mother Earth and the Father Sky, to confront carbon colonialism, climate capitalism. But my last comment, and then other people want to speak, is we're gonna, our network of indigenous people, we're gonna sit down with our brothers from the Amazon that are building this Amazon Sacred Headwaters initiative. And I asked the new coordinator at the IUCN last year in Marseille, where's the money coming from on this big venture to protect 80% of the biodiversity? Who is funding that? Is that Ecuador as a government? Where's the money coming from? Because I see it's an offset initiative, but they're very cautious on the language, which creates a confusion. So there's terminology, I'll leave with this terminology around that's being used as debt trading, debt for nature swap. What is this debt for nature swap? And, we see, I think Yvonne had mentioned China. It's a wild card. I've been to Ecuador. I'm not an expert, but I see that Ecuador has a national debt that's owed to China. I don't know the background of that, but with payments that are linked to expanding oil production, oil concessions, what is the link and the war room discussion in the back rooms that our local brothers and sisters of the community don't know about? How do we hold the intermediaries accountable? It's because it's tearing our people apart. Here, some folks I've known for years in the fight for the rights of indigenous peoples, we don't trust each other anymore. We don't go out and eat together anymore. So this is something that I want to share with people. This is the mechanisms, the strategies of the big funded NGOs and the financial institutions, the brokers, the traders, and the governments. They're all know that they're dividing our community, our people. They don't care. They really don't care. They just want to implement this whole market scheme. So the narrative, what is the narrative that we are confronting here? And the nature-based solution, they even co-opted our narrative as indigenous peoples. They use reconnect the people to nature. And some of our allies, NGOs, they say, this is what you've been fighting for. You want the world to link to nature. So what's wrong with nature-based solutions? And they say here they want to bring nature back as a center stage of human societies. Harmony between people and nature, as well as ecological development. And they want to use the word holistic, or even viva, what's that word? Live well-being, living in a good way. And they manipulated these terminologies. So we got to be really sharp and keen on this. And and work towards strategy to maintain solidarity, because we are being divided, but our allies who are not indigenous are being divided on this issue. So I thank you very much.
Muchísimas gracias, Tom, por esta
Thank you,
contribución.
Tom, for your contribution, crucial contribution, also to emphasize the layers, the deep-seated layers and harmful layers of the burden that is being put on the shoulders of indigenous peoples and other players who are supporting their struggles. And this question of terminology, of language is key. Thank you for reminding us of that and how we mustn't be confused. We mustn't be misled. Okay, now I want to invite our next guest. We are going to ask Izudin from Indonesia. Are you here, Izudin?
Yeah, hello, I'm here.
Hello, Izudin. Good evening to you. I believe it's the evening where you live.
Yeah.
So Izudin is from the Agrarian Resources Center in Indonesia, also an author of one of the chapters in our publication. Your article highlights the situation of the Bapinang Hilir village in Indonesia, which is located next to the Katingan Red Plus project area, but inside the area accounted as verified project zone according to the certification schemes. This means, as you explain, so this is an interesting point. This means, as you explain in your article, that the community is targeted with social projects in order for the project to receive the needed certification for selling the credits for more money. So how does the certification process of a REDD project harm communities, according to your experience?
Okay, thank you, John. Thank you, WRM, for inviting me. Good morning, good afternoon, and good night for everyone. Yeah, what I'm talking here is 300,000 hectares of RED project that's encompass, yeah, a lot of village, almost 20 villages encompass 2 regions in central Kalimantan of Indonesia. And the projects is the carbon offset of the project that's composed is only, I think, 99% from the REDD and WRC. And with the actual planting trees of the ARR mechanism is only 0.1. So the main jobs that they were doing there is only enclosing people, coordination and cooperation with the law enforcement to jailing people, to jail people that will try to live with the forest product. And the condition of they create, it plays a burden on the weight to the people who live there. And apart from the limiting access to the forest, we need to talk about another mechanism that's introduced after the Glasgow conference, that's international transferable mitigation of outcomes. And actually, in the past of a decade in Indonesia, Norwegian has invested a lot of money in strengthening of the law enforcement of the forest crime, which that's happening in the Bapinang Hilir villages, where the people who usually before planting paddy field, planting rice in the paddy field, they usually burn several plots of land. Of course, they protect the land of protect the fire from spreading to another plots. They've done that since long time ago, 100 years, 200 years, and nowadays they cannot do that anymore because of the threat of being imprisoned, 20 years of imprisonment and the fine of $100,000. And because of that, the people nowadays farmers rely more and more on the herbicide. This needs a lot of money to plant the rice on their paddy field. It leads to the abandonment of their land. And then, of course, when the land is being abandoned, it also increase the fire occurrence in the padland because no one else can guard the land. If they guarding the land, when the fire occur, they will be accused of burning the land. That's why people can be people very afraid of going into their land in the fire season. And it implies that because of the rising costs on planting paddy fields, people usually sell their land and they didn't have anything to do. Usually they went to the forest to catch a fish or cut the forest product, some timbers for nearby house and stuff like that. But nowadays they cannot do that. And then also the conditions of the people when there are elites in the Bapinang Hill, user elite, local capitalists that control a lot of lands and they created conditions of which land becoming degraded. So the people usually very easy to plant paddy field, and nowadays they very hard to plant some paddy fields on there, and the kind of degradation is being commodified by the REDD project, of which they enclose the land, and the REDD project also introduce more the marginalized people becoming more and more marginalized because of they cannot plant the usual rice paddy in their paddy in the usual way, so they need to introduce a lot of herbicides. And the conditions of people's marginalization in the context of REDD plus, people's being seen as the threat of at the first hand, people seen as the threat to the carbon emissions, so the people must be controlled not to enter the forest. And then nowadays, because of the result of the REDD plus and because of the result of forest degradation, which actually induced by the REDD plus, people seen as the commodity that the REDD project introduced some certification, CCBS certification, climate community and biodiversity certification that calculate and gain areas of people's livelihood. If people's livelihood without their intervention will become more and more severe, and then when they do intervention, the livelihood is becoming more and more good. That's only happen in the certification as part of the carbon accounting. And yeah, I see that the REDD is not only seeing the people as the threat. The REDD created conditions of in the creative conditions of in poverty and marginalization in there, and in that condition they commodify the people by introducing their livelihood into the carbon accounting as part of the certification mechanism. One of them, the climate community biodiversity certification. And because of that additionality of certifications, they generate a lot of more money. So the carbon credits become more value. And in actuality, the director of the REDD project speak to myself that they're not only selling the carbon, they also sell the people. I mean, sell the people in terms of some logic of people and enrichment, community development, stuff like that. So actually, already been commodified by the REDD plus.
Muchísimas gracias, Isudin, por tu participación. Es casi hasta devastador.
Thank you very much, Ituding, for your contribution. It's almost, it's very hard to hear what are the very deep impacts, which are many of them very direct and others indirect. And the population have been submitted to new forms of the control of their ways of life and their livelihoods. So thank you very much. Now I'm going to invite Nasako, the next speaker. Are you with us, Nasako? While while they open their microphone, I'm going to ask you again to put your comments and questions on the chat because we're going to use them for the final moment of our meeting. Seems that Nasako is not here now. He had a problem with the connection. So let's move to the next participant and see if Nasako can join us later. So, Ladislas? Ladislas, are you with us? I'd seen you before. Where are you?
Oui, je suis là.
Hola,
Je
Ladislas.
suis là.
Yes, I'm here.
Vous me suivez? Vous m'entendez bien?
Can you hear me?
Vous m'entendez bien?
Perdón, voy a ponerme...
D'accord.
Oui.
Merci. L'occasion pour moi déjà de saluer tout le monde.
Thank you very much. It's an important occasion for me to greet you all and to thank the organization of this meeting about the 15 years of REDD. And talking about REDD, of course, we in Gabon, we have a project, a REDD project, but a project that does not show shows its true name. We don't see who are the promoters of this project. We don't talk about REDD directly. We talk about tourism. They talk about exploring, using the forest. We talk about agro-industrial projects, but we don't say REDD directly. This is happening in national reservation, conservation area, Mayumba National Park in Gabon, created in 1992. That's a network of 13 conservation national parks, protecting a good area, a good proportion of our territory. Mayumba has about 5,000 people living there. The image of the country, it's a region important for the image of the country. We have indigenous people, people there who come from neighbor countries in Africa and from West Africa who work on trade. Oh, this is an area of national park. 20 years after the coastal park of Mayumba, the communities there are disappointed because they cannot anymore use the natural resources from the lagoons, from the Atlantic Ocean. The population, particularly fisher folk and farmers, are being victims of many restrictions. The fishing communities cannot fish. Fishing is forbidden for them in the coast. They cannot fish for oysters anymore, so their food sovereignty is under attack. I have the luck of coming from there. I was raised there, and we would eat oysters frequently, and now we cannot consume oysters in the communities of Mayumba because of the strong conservation policy that has been established there. The farmers do not have access to the forests anymore because the forests have been put in the hands of the promoters of REDD mechanisms. So it means the suffering of the populations of the small villages. While this national park could have at its could mean that the populations could be could have their development promoted. What we see instead that they are deeper and deeper in a precarious situation. That means the disappointment, the suffering of the communities. There is a consulting committee formed by the local population that was legally a legal guarantee when the park was established. This has always been formal. The structure does not work properly, and that happened also in detriment of the local populations, their territories, that they are losing their land every year. And we have to say that in Gabon, the land belongs to the state, and the state, in a country where corruption is a major factor, the mechanisms of law is being used to appropriate the land. The government is expanding the conservation areas in the sea and on the land, so the communities are being isolated by the conservation policies created by the government in the framework of policies that put public-private partnerships as the only solution. So, and many times these policies do not be directly stated. We don't say that their names. So this is what we're going through in Mayumba, in the southeast part of the country. And as I said before, this project does not present itself as a REDD project, but they use this covering. It is disguised. They use other names for it. And so this solution, the so-called nature-based solutions, and we have to say that Gabon is a leading country in Africa through the president. Gabon is leading climate change in Africa, and Gabon is defending strongly this false solution, aiming for getting investment. Norway had promised $150 million, and that money started to come over the past years in the form of compensations. This compensation for carbon credit, this is a very difficult situation being misgoverned, and the communities are suffering with the new carbon market policy. So we have to multiply this kind of meetings, especially after the next COP. So, or this kind of solution can disappear from our territories.
Muchas gracias, Ladislas, por tu contribución. Es claro
Thank
que
you very much, Ladislas, for your contribution. We know that Gabon is an example of the contradictions that are very visible in the mechanisms such as REDD and nature-based solutions. We know that Total, the company that's been extracting oil from Gabon over the past 80 years, they bought also a timber extraction company in Gabon, half of the company. So as you have explained, Ladislas, there's much contradiction, and those who are being affected are especially the communities. And you talk a lot about that in your article, and we invite you all to read Ladislas' article in the book. So now, well, we had planned now Dercy Teles would be with us now to provide with a contribution. She is a militant from the Rural Workers Union in Chapuri from Acre in Brazil. That's one of the states. This has been a model, quote unquote, of the green economy. But for problems in the connection, she could not join this meeting. But we didn't. We wanted to mention still that what she was going. Well, we did an interview with her for the book, and what she brings is the reflection on the impact of REDD projects and investments on women's lives specifically. This is the perspective that is very important, that many times is absent from our analysis. And between, among other things, that Darcy says, she talks about how the zero fire policy for the implementation of REDD has impacted the communities, and especially women who are responsible for the daily work in agriculture and agroecological work. So we are inviting you to read her interview on our book, so you can get to know the different aspects of the situation she brings. So next, well, we couldn't talk to Nasako. He's trying to join us, as someone is saying on the chat. But let's go to the next speaker, and let's see if he can join us meanwhile. So now, Larry, are you there?
Yes, I'm here.
Hola, Larry. Bienvenido.
Hello.
Buenos días.
Hi, Larry. Nice to see you. He's a member of the Corner House research group he's one of the authors of the publication. Now, in your article, you have stated that, quote, REDD works best when it's most colonialist, end of quote. This phrase, in a way, unpacks the underpinning logic of how and why REDD was conceived. Why is it? And how did this mechanism and others, based on the same logic that have come before REDD and will come after REDD, has managed to survive for so many years now?
Thanks, Joanna. And hello, everybody. It's good to be here. It's an important issue, REDD and colonialism. REDD has always been haunted by its own colonialism. I remember many years ago, and this was more than 20 years ago, an African delegate to the UN climate talks getting angry at the idea that land and forests in the global south were there to absorb the carbon dioxide emitted by the industrialized north. For him, that was like the north using the south as its toilet. No matter how many reforms are made, REDD can never overcome this colonialist stigma. This is because the economic logic of REDD is to make it cheaper for big companies to continue business as usual than to change. The global south will never get much money for doing REDD. That would defeat the whole purpose. But REDD's colonialism goes much deeper than just land grabs. In fact, the more that people try to reform REDD, the more colonialist it becomes. Why? In order to be able to continue burning fossil fuels as usual, buyers of REDD credits have to be able to show that they are the ones who are saving the forest with their money. They have to be the ones who take credit, literally, for making the difference between forest and no forest. But that means making absolutely sure that no one else can take the credit for saving their relevant bit of forest. If REDD carbon accounting companies want to keep their jobs, they must show that without REDD, no one else would be able to save this piece of forest. Forest dwellers, local social movements, local governments, nobody. The accountants are obligated to ignore many good things that might already be going on without REDD. That means maintaining a colonialist attitude. Oh, those people in the global south can't do it. Only I can do it. This is a professional requirement of carbon accountants. It gets worse. Carbon accountants not only need to give REDD buyers credit for saving forests, they also have to show exactly how much credit they can take, because they have to show exactly how much fossil fuel they will be entitled to burn as a result of buying REDD credits. So forest dwellers and others in the global south must not only be portrayed as incapable of acting constructively enough without REDD money, they must also be shown to be predictable statistically in terms of what they would do without REDD money. There can only be one baseline for a REDD project, and that baseline must be precisely quantified. A lot of critics think that the problem with REDD is that the predictions about what might happen without a REDD project are just not accurate enough. But what happens when you try to make them more accurate? Your only option is to try to make local people in the global south look more predictable and more passive. And the only way you can do that is to reinforce again and again the old colonialist myth that the natives are less than animals, without initiative, without free will, without a future that they can call their own, without a future that they can make for themselves. This is why colonialism in REDD is not just land grabbing. Colonialism is also a technical, mathematical requirement of REDD carbon accounting. And the more accurate that REDD tries to make that accounting, the more colonialist it will become. REDD survives partly because critics who call for more precise baselines don't realize that in doing so, they are also calling for more colonialism. Thank you.
Muchas gracias, Larry, por poner.
Thank you very much, Larry, for being so direct and explicit about the relation between carbon and colonialism, and to showing us how important this is, how important it is to change the mentality of that structure, the local realities. Thank you. I believe Nasako, unfortunately, could not join us. He came in and out again. If he joins, please let me know so we can ask him to speak. But now I have a couple of questions from you all that I would like to share as we have some time left. Are we all connected? So I'm going to start with 2 or 3 of these questions, and then we can move on. There is a question directed to Yvonne. Yvonne, Yvonne, are you there?
She's here.
Seems that yes, she. Sorry, I didn't see you. So many people. I was out for a minute to get some water. Could you repeat the question? No, I didn't ask it yet. So why is this tension and this of the focus on climate change and not in the loss of biodiversity? So why is this focus so strong on climate change? What does it mean? What is this trade of nature for?
Sí, está bien. Para terminar con las presentaciones, que él sería el último. Nasako, ¿estás aquí?
Nasako, are you there?
Yes, I'm here.
Oh, qué bueno, Nasako. Me alegra mucho que lograste. Entonces, antes de pasar a las preguntas.
Oh, it's great you could join us. So welcome to this meeting, to this conversation. So happy the technical problems could be solved. Nasako Bintingi is from Cameroon, social and environmental activist and human rights defender. So I'm going to share the question. REDD projects and now also the so-called nature-based solutions are often being established on existing and or newly created conservation areas, with the argument that without REDD money, those forests would be destroyed. This is becoming increasingly a threat for those people living in the forest, as the UN and its allies, including conservation NGOs, are pushing to establish 30% of the land on Earth under some conservation scheme. Many governments are thus expanding the land that supposedly belongs, quote unquote, belongs to the state for turning them into national parks. Most often, and especially in Africa, indigenous peoples and other communities living in that land, they live in that land that governments want to turn into national parks or carbon concessions. What do you think about this idea that the land belongs to the state, and what could be important strategies for strengthening resistance against this trend?
Hello?
Sí, hello, Nasako. We hear you.
Yeah. Okay. Um, can you remind me again, because I've been on and off?
Sí, I can say it in English. So what do you think about this idea of the land belongs to the state? And how can we fight against, or how can we solidarize with the resistance against this idea?
First of all, it is very good to trying to situate what in Africa, people tend to, leaders and even people who are policymakers, they tend to confuse the two. No, they would think that the government is state. But actually, it is not. The government duty was just to legislate and represent a people with a particular geographical residence. But over time, because of because of resources and people want to make money and so on, they will confront this to say, oh, it is the government. It's not the government. State is not the government. State is made up of different elements, and the most important element is the people. There is no state without people, and there is no people without land. Constitute a state. And the government is just like an agent of the state. But this is not reflected all the time. And our people don't understand that they need to understand this very well. And when they talk of land belongs to the state, it's another way, it's a kind of another way to marginalized communities, is to make sure that they don't have a voice. They're trying to take things from people by giving them the impression that it's a state. A state means it is them. And it was based on the principle of the state that we were able, as a community in Cameroon, land grabbing, because these are the kinds of issues. And we made this very clear. I remember I was in the conference at the national level, and the 4 ministers were there. And they started talking of land, the government has to decide. I said, no, look, even the Constitution says the unused land belongs to the state. And the state here is the community. And the government is not the state. The government is guardian of state issues. That's by legislation. They can legislate, or nobody can take one part of the land, which is today known as Cameroon land, and give it to maybe a neighboring country. It is the state. So it is all.
Me parece que hemos perdido la conexión con Nasako, lamentablemente.
It seems we have lost Nasako. It's very important, I think, the point he wanted to make, reflecting critically about this idea that the land belongs to the state. Also, with Ladislas was saying with the Mayumba project, this idea that because it's supposedly state land, it's there to be taken by the state and to be sold by the state, perhaps. So Nasako previously, in a discussion we had earlier, how the communities he worked with, none of them even had this idea that it was inconceivable that the land belonged to the state. It obviously belonged to their community. Let's see if he's able to rejoin. But I think we're going to go to some of the questions and see how far we get. Okay, so Yvonne, I think you were able. Shall I repeat the question, Yvonne? Maybe it's better to repeat it for the people, not for me, right? So why is there this tension on climate change and not, for example, on biodiversity loss? And perhaps you can explain also the meaning of this, the swaps, the debt for nature swaps that Tom was talking about relating to Ecuador. Thank you. Well, I think that actually the same tension exists. What happens is that the same tension in terms of offsets of biodiversity loss with the same with CO2 emissions. For me, it's the same. What happens is that climate change is more easily sellable as a question that we're all going to die tomorrow. So with this sort of catastrophistic idea of climate change, it's easier to sell the idea that the false solutions are the answers for climate change, including the REDD-like projects. In the case of biodiversity loss, they don't resort so much to catastrophism, but it's the same mechanism. I think that the carbon market, I think the offset market for biodiversity loss was born before carbon. It was born in the 70s in the 70s in the United States. So there's the same tension, the same mechanism, and it's related, of course, because now what they want to do is bring everything together, as Camila Moreno said, with a carbon metric. So the biodiversity units will be measured as carbon equivalents. And so the sustainable development goals will also be measured possibly with carbon metrics. So in other words, you're losing. If a community is displaced, you can offset it with carbon offset equivalent. It's crazy, but it's the same tension. I think it's a question that biodiversity loss and offsets, social offsets will become more appealing in the future. And the debt for nature swaps, briefly, maybe 30 years ago in Ecuador, 30 years ago, there was a swap between debt for nature, also in Costa Rica. So you create a fund, a fiduciary fund where you fund conservation projects. And with this new wave of projects of debt for nature swaps, not just in Ecuador, it's happening in many countries in Argentina, Peru, Central America. What they want to do now is to link it, what we're talking about, which is the financialization of nature, the projects of offsets or environmental services projects. In the concrete case of Ecuador, for instance, what the government announced in the summit in Glasgow, COP26, that together with other American countries, they're going to increase the Galapagos protected area, but they're going to have a corridor with other countries in Central America. They're going to create a fiduciary fund for this debt for nature fund, which is not about debt cancellation. Instead of paying the creditors, the Ecuador will create a fund with investors, not donors, investors, and they're going to protect the Galapagos areas and other zones. But investigating who is behind all this, we found out that these are blue carbon investors that invest in blue carbon bonds. So they buy bonds and they want to just do business. And this is associated with, probably in the case of Ecuador, with the US interference, because there's a government authority of the US involved in this process and could be connected with the use of Galapagos as a military base and the use of landing strips there for US military aircraft. So it's a big, full package. Thank you, Yvonne. Incredible the implications that these things can have. And it's important to know that this is happening in many countries, because we have to see, we have to have clarity about how all this is happening in other continents as well, to put eyes on the question and pressure. Okay, let's see. Another question. Forgive us, we cannot read all the questions. There have been many rich contributions, very important comments here. Forgive us, we're not able to read them all out. So, Isudin, are you among us? Isudin, are you here?
Yeah.
So there's a question for you. I'm going to ask it in English, okay?
Transforming people into a commodity. That maybe you can develop it a bit more to understand what do you mean by that, of transforming people into a commodity by this REDD project.
Okay.
Briefly, please.
I try to explain. REDD plus project, when calculating the carbon offset from the land, is calculating the scenarios, the baseline scenarios of several plots of land that kind of that before the introduction of the REDD project, how much emission they'll emit. They'll also do the same to the livelihood of the people in order to increase the value of their carbon offset. They calculate the scenario of people's livelihood in terms of what their jobs are, what the levels of their education, what's the problem in relation to the elite culture, degradations, stuff like that. They calculate on how, in the baseline scenario of livelihood, without intervention, how much the people fare in their life. And then they create another scenario, intervention scenario, what they're gonna do in terms of increasing livelihood, education livelihood, introducing project, introducing supply chain, so coconut project. And they calculate on how much the livelihood of the people, which those who live in the project zone, increase. Through that, they increase their valuation of carbon offsets. The main certification for a carbon offset is voluntary carbon offset developed by Vera. And then with the additionality of climate, community, and biodiversity certificate, they add, I think, the data from 2017, they add 1.4 US dollar per ton per unit of carbon. And I've seen that as the part of the commodification of the people who live in the project zone. And do not forget that because of the people live in the forested area, in the area that is designated as the state forest, there's a lot of limitation of what they can and cannot do. For instance, they are prohibited to live in the state assigned forest area, and the carbon project, which encompass the people lives, is also controlling on how, with the introduction of so-called sustainable farming and stuff like that, directing people onto switch from the unsustainable agriculture to they perceive as the sustainable agriculture method.
Gracias, Isudin. También relacionado esto al tema del lenguaje, ¿no? Como los
Thank you, Izudin. Once again, the issue of language, how REDD proponents, they say, we're going to change the so-called unsustainable agriculture, but in fact, it's the agriculture that was based on ancestral knowledge with a certain level of migration over time. This is something that this knowledge of soils and how they work has been developed over centuries and millennia, and then suddenly this colonial mentality comes from outside to promote essentially corporate interests. Thank you very much for that. Okay, we have a question for Ladislas. Ladislas, are you among us? Are you on the call? Are you here, Ladislas? I think you're here, yes. Okay, I have a question for you, Ladislas. I'm going to say it in English, okay?
DRC, the country that is the leader in terms of climate policy in Africa, because of the years of preparation, it has already a legislation and etc. In what sense do you think Gabon is profiling itself as a leader in climate policy?
Je ne sais pas si j'ai très bien compris la question, mais au niveau de la législation...
The question says that in theory, the DRC, the Democratic Republic of Congo, is the leader in terms of climate policy in Africa because of all the preparation, the legislation, no? All the things that have gone around DRC. So do you think Gabon now is trying to be a leader in this climate policy?
Gabon, for a certain number of years, is playing this leadership role regarding its climate policy through the President of the Republic, who is practically a cheerleader of this matter, despite his poor health. For the Minister of Water Resources and Forests, he has it's important to say that the history of the national park is based on the idea of this British gentleman who is the minister. This is an adventure that he started in the 90s. Back in 2002, for instance, he brought a decree forward to create the national park. That's his job. On my part, this is my personal opinion, I have the impression that this British gentleman is a cheerleader for the West's policy. This capitalist policy this capitalist idea that is bringing to a country like Gabon. We were in an intermediary situation, but precariousness and poverty is on the increase in our country, in fact. There is a review of the forest statute taking place in our country, and this review, civil society theoretically is present to put across its point of view and to take part in this review. There was a block on debate. So the authorities want to put everything inside of this statute, of this forest code, to the detriment of the populations, the local communities that are being truly expropriated from their land. This idea of climate change is a business for the government. So Norway is starting to fund these offsets, and we fear these aspects being inserted in Gabonese national legislation. And there is no consideration to climate change in the global sense. And it's the same for the REDD project. These discussions happen at high level, but at the local level, people are completely unaware and kept in the dark, in fact. Thank you, Ladislas, for clarifying these different worlds, this huge disconnect between what is seen on the ground and what the national debates that are taking place.
I have I think many things we have learned here, and many reflections are coming out of this conversation. But we are already over time limit, and we know that we are all very busy doing many things. I would not like to wrap up this conversation without giving thanks to each one of you who have joined us, not only with your presentations, but also all the people who have joined us to learn. And we're very happy that there's been this much interest. We had more than 200 people registered to participate. That means we can have more interactions like this, exchanges, reflection on this mechanism, not only REDD, but nature-based solutions or any other names they give it after the negotiations that are coming next week, for us to be aware, alert, and keeping solidarity alive. So thank you all, and I believe this wraps up our the seminar, this meeting, this conversation. We hope it's been fruitful to each one of you, that we have learned much together. So thank you very much. Goodbye. Great to see your faces there.